What is our learning objective for today? Our learning objective is to understand the characteristics of data and data source. So you have to be familiar with these two terms, data and data source. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning everyone. It's great to see you again in my class, Linguistic Research Methodology. Today, we will be focusing on data and data source. Remember students, data and data source is actually part of methodology chapter. You need to know about this data and data source. Okay, let us start. First, what is our learning objective for today? Our learning objective is to understand the characteristics of data and data source. So you have to be familiar with these two terms, data and data source. Okay, what is data actually? I'm sure you've known about what is data, but there's nothing wrong if we look again at definition of data. Data is principally any content or information in basic or unprocessed form that can be analyzed and presented to further analysis. It can be facts, details, or statistics. Now, if we look at types of data, there are two kinds of data according to Merriam and Podesva and Sharma. Number one is primary data, and number two is secondary data. Now, what is primary data? In your research, you will use either primary or secondary data. You can also use both of data. Now, let us check one by one. All right. Primary data is the kind of data that is collected directly from the data source. So you will be the person who directly collect the data. So it is well known as first-hand data and mainly collected through interviews, observations, surveys, and questionnaires. This is also according to Merriam, Podesva, and Sharma. Okay, actually, every types of data has strengths and weaknesses. So there is no particular what we call as the best data or the best data source. Each of them has strengths and weaknesses. Now, let us take a look at the strengths of primary data. Number one, the researcher is able to control the kind of data that is being collected. Number two, the authenticity can be trusted. And number three, the researcher exhibits ownership of the data collected through primary research. The next strength of primary data is that primary data is usually up to date because it collects data in real time. And the next one is the researcher has full control over the data collected through primary research. Of course, besides the strengths, primary data also has some weaknesses. Here are the weaknesses. Number one, primary data is more expensive compared to secondary data. Number two, it is time consuming. And number three, it requires a long-term commitment. Now, what about secondary data? Secondary data is the data that has been collected in the past by someone else, but made available for others to use, like research articles, reports, or other published resource provided by government agencies, for example, or associations. It is necessary for us to look at the strengths and weaknesses of secondary data as well. We look at the strengths first. Number one, secondary data is easily accessible compared to primary data because it is available. They are available on different platforms that can be accessed by the researcher. Number two, secondary data is more affordable, little to no cost at all to acquire them because they are mostly available for free. Here are some weaknesses of secondary data. Number one, secondary data may not be authentic and reliable. It needs further verification. You need somebody else to validate the authenticity of the data. Number two, researchers may have to deal with irrelevant data before finally finding the required data. And number three, secondary data sources are sometimes outdated. Now, we move to primary data source. We already talked about data. Now we move to data source. Okay, first, we discuss about primary data source first. A primary source is anything that gives you direct evidence about the people, events, or phenomena that are searched or that you are searching. Primary sources will usually be the main objects of your analysis. All right? So you directly look into that data source for your research. Okay, primary data sources in language and linguistic studies. For example, okay, you can look at interview transcripts. For example, you interview people. Okay, recording of speeches. You look at speeches of prominent figures, leaders, CEOs, for example, that you record and you make them as primary data source. Number three, you analyze newspapers, you analyze magazines, you analyze novels. Those are also called as primary data source. You may be also investigating social media posts. You're interested looking at the use of language in, let's say, Instagram, Facebook, yeah, or websites. So you can look into that as well, and it is categorized as primary data source. For example, you look at semiotic studies. You can study photographs. Yeah, you can study billboard, for example. You can also look at video footage. Now, secondary data source, secondary data sources in language and linguistic studies can be, for example, you look at British Council websites. Why? Because you are looking at statistics of speakers of English as a second or foreign language in Asia. All right? So this source or the website can be your secondary data sources. Yeah. Second one, for example, you look at Indonesian Linguistic Society database because you're going to investigate minority language or endangered language, and the language that is still used by the minority ethnic groups in Indonesia. All right? Or maybe you can look at UNESCO research findings. You look at their database of research about endangered language in Africa, let's say. Okay? You may also, look at World Bank annual report. Why? Because you want to study about the skills demanded by the industries, including the communication and language skills. All right? So these website, database, research findings, annual report are categorized as your secondary data source. Now, maybe you have learned about data and data source, primary data and primary data source. All right? So how to tell if a source is primary or secondary? Shortly, you have to pay attention to these 3 points. Number one, you need to ask yourself, Does this source come from someone directly involved in the events I'm studying? If it is yes, it means that you use primary data source. If it is from another researcher, it means that you use secondary data source. All right, that's point number one. Point number two, ask yourself again, am I interested in analyzing the source itself? Yeah, directly you want to look at the source itself. If that's the case, it means that you are dealing with primary data and data source. But if you use it for background of information only, yeah, to support your literature review, yeah, looking at from the existing journals, for example, it means that you are dealing with secondary data and data source. All right? And number three, again, you need to ask yourself, does the source provide original information, which means, original directly from the source? If it provides original information, it means that you use primary data and data source. However, if, it comments upon information from other sources, it means that you're using secondary data and data source. So easy. You look at these 3 points and you ask yourself. So you will find the answer whether you use primary or secondary data and data source. Now, I would like to give you some example of research or study which uses primary data and data source. Look at your screen. This is example number 1. So the title of this research is Cohesive Conjunctions and So as Discourse Strategies in English Native and Non-Native Engineering Lectures, a corpus-based study. Look, if you look at this study, it means that the researchers use primary data source. All right? Second, prepare strategies in English literature lectures in a university in Indonesia. So the example of this research and the previous example that I have shown you use lectures. Look at the lectures. So the researchers observe the classroom directly. Yeah? The researchers investigated the classroom interactions directly by looking at what is going on in the classroom by video recording. So it means that because the researchers, they study, look directly into the object, the subjects being investigated, it means that they use primary data and data source. This one also uses primary data source because the study looked at representations of people with HIV/AIDS in the Jakarta Post and Jakarta Globe. It means that these researchers look directly into a document, a text, newspapers, on particular issue, which is HIV/AIDS, people with HIV/AIDS. So they look directly into the text, analyze the text, for their and in order to get the findings how people with HIV/AIDS are presented in the newspaper. So it means that they use primary data and data source. Now, what about research which uses secondary data source? I will give you 3 examples as well. Look at this example number 1. These researchers look at the trends of multilingualism in applied linguistics and education from 2000 until 2019. So if you look at this title, it is already clear that this person looked at the existing researches that have been done before. So looking at what people have done in multilingualism in applied linguistics in relation to education. So these people are doing, library research, library study. They look at literature review study, on the existing paper already published. The second example is also similar to example number 1. Yeah, looking at the trends in applied linguistics, yeah, from 2005. Yeah, because the study looked at the bibliometric analysis and its implication. All right, so they review the existing studies about applied linguistics from particular years. It means that the study has been done by many people before, and they just summarize, then look at it and present in form of literature review paper. Yeah, and this last example about secondary data and data source is that these also look at the trends in educational research about e-learning, yeah, also systematic literature review. It means that they use library research. It means that they use secondary data and data source, I mean. All right, I have explained to you about data and data source, yeah, primary and secondary. Now it is important for you to practice by yourself. All right, listen very carefully. Number 1, please find 2 previous linguistic studies related to your research topics. You must have topics in your mind, right? So think, yeah, and make it relevant with the previous studies. Analyze them, whether they use primary and secondary data source. Yeah, read them carefully, compare and contrast them. After that, you need to report to me in the following meetings. Okay? What's next? Next, we also will still deal with methodology. So we will discuss about data collecting technique and data analyzing technique. Okay? That's all from me for today. Thank you and bye-bye.
Terima kasih sudah menyaksikan video pembelajaran ini. Jangan lupa like, komen dan subscribe, serta nyalakan tanda loncengnya agar kalian tidak ketinggalan informasi update lainnya.